Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Kid Talks with Kendo World, and today we're very lucky to have as our guest Mr. Graham Sayer, who's living the life in New Zealand, corona-free at the moment. We hope it stays that way. Graham has had over 35 years of training and teaching and promoting Kendo to New Zealanders and also people in other countries, including China, which Graham has a fairly close relationship with. He's represented New Zealand in the international Kendo community in varying roles, from an executive member of the International Kendo Federation, member of the New Zealand Kendo team at several World Kendo Championships, and is also currently holds the grade of Kyoshi Nanadan. Congratulations on your recent Kyoshi, by the way, Graham. Graham was also the president of the New Zealand Kendo Federation for a whopping 32 years, from 1988 through to 2020, when the New Zealand Kendo Federation underwent some monumental changes in structure, to which Graham retired from his position. So I'd like to welcome you to Kid Talk today, and Graham, thank you very much for taking the time out to join us.
Absolute pleasure, Alex. It's nice to be with you.
Yep, well, I've known you for almost as long as I've done Kendo. I remember meeting you for the first time, I think it was in 1988, which was just after I got back from my one-year exchange in Japan, where I started Kendo, and Kendo wasn't much of a thing in New Zealand at the time. I started the Kendo Club in Christchurch because there were no others, but I soon found out that there was a New Zealand Kendo Federation in existence, and that's what prompted me to contact you. This was, of course, the age before email. I don't remember it was a fax that I sent off to you, but I went up to Auckland from Christchurch to meet you, and the rest, as they say, is history. So can you give us a little bit of background of New Zealand Kendo Federation, Graham? Because I think when I made contact with you, it hadn't been going for that long, had it?
No, it hadn't, Alex, and I actually remember very clearly you fronting up on that day with your suit and little thin black tie. It's quite a picture. The Kendo was effectively introduced into New Zealand by Kasahara Sensei back in the day, and I have a feeling, from what I've heard anyway, that it was a roving delegation that had gone to Australia and then tagged on a few days in New Zealand. And thanks to a couple of individuals in New Zealand, one in particular, Mr. Tony Crawford, Kendo started to get a little bit established in the main centres, which at that stage was Auckland and Wellington. That would have been back in the early 70s. And during a number, I was in Japan from 77 through until 85. And in about the beginning of the 80s, so probably 81, 82, I made a trip back to New Zealand, and that was my first real contact with New Zealand Kenshi. Up until that stage, I'd been doing Kendo only in Japan, in Kyoto. So it was actually my first time to practice with a non-Japanese other than a gentleman by the name of Leslie Denniston and the late Brian Kay. So and that was as you've just said, all history.
Just to cut in there, Graham, I think a few people might have heard of the name of Les Denniston before, because he was the Scottish Kendo practitioner who lives in Kyoto, who featured in that very well-known BBC series on martial arts, wasn't he?
He certainly was. As a matter of fact, Alex, I'd only been doing Kendo a year when that was filmed. And Les, I owe Les a lot because he was the only foreigner doing kendo in Kyoto at that time, and my Japanese was very limited. And so I sort of followed him around, as it were. And I didn't actually see the filming, but I do remember him telling me of the BBC guys coming to the dojo with their shoes on and throwing cables and lights everywhere.
Blasphemy.
Yeah, absolutely. Him dying in the corner of embarrassment. And yes, but that program certainly was a bit of a hit. And and in my understanding, last time I saw Les would have been 3 or 4 years ago. Unfortunately, he's not doing kendo now, but he still lives happily with his wife in Kyoto.
Yeah, well, so, we'll go back to New Zealand kendo and look at some of the things that you've seen over the years a little bit later. But while we're on the topic of your escapades in Kyoto, which just happens to be where I'm at the moment, perhaps you can give us a little bit of background how you actually got started in kendo. What prompted you to take up kendo? Because I know that you were involved in judo for a while.
I was. I started judo when I was 13 or 14 in a place called New Plymouth, which is a relatively small city by New Zealand standards on the west coast. I was lucky enough to have an experience of going to a seminar led by a kendo teacher from Doshisha University in Kyoto in my second or third year of judo. And it impressed myself and a very good friend of mine, Bill Vincent, so much that we made a promise at the age of 16. We were going to save all our pennies and do this and do that, and we were definitely going to go to Japan. And so that actually came to pass. And I was in Japan a month, and I had my 20th birthday. And I went, in all honesty, I went, I think, as a brown belt, and I went with the dream of getting my black belt. In a completely different league was Bill, and he went with his goal of representing New Zealand at the Olympics. And as a matter of fact, went on, he was selected for Moscow, but unfortunately there was a boycott. But he went on to represent New Zealand another couple of times after that. I did judo for a couple of years, and I was on the old 4163, I think was the name of it. Was the number of the visa we had in those days. It was a cultural visa. And I realized quite soon that I wasn't really that good at judo, and I liked to pretend I was, but just wasn't happening. I mean, I got my Shodan, and as we all know, Shodan is the beginning. I got my knee done, but I spent a lot of time getting injured. I spent a lot of time practicing, but not really seemingly getting far. Mm-hmm. And one day I got quite badly injured, my left knee, and I actually ended up in hospital. But prior to that, the judo teacher explained to me that, I need to have some time off. And as I say, I went on and had an operation. When I came out of the operation, part of my rehabilitation was to do a whole lot of exercises and so on and so forth. I went along to explain to my judo teacher at Doshisha that I wouldn't be able to do normal practice. And he said, "Oh, well, you're doing too much of that weight training stuff," because in those days it was all linked up, and all had to go to the gym and jump up and down and stuff. So he said, "Here, take this." And he gave me a shinai. And he said, "Swing that around. It'll loosen you up on the shoulders. You can't do much with your legs at the moment." And I thought, what's this? I honestly didn't know. Now, for those people that have been to the old Doshisha campus, judo and kendo were quite close, so there was a whole lot of noise going on along the hall that I never even bothered to have a look at. Anyway, I went on, took the shinai home, and my then Japanese girlfriend just happened to have done kendo at high school, and she explained to me what it was. sounded pretty good. And there was a New Zealander by the name of Brian Haddad, who lived in Kyoto, and as a matter of fact, still does live in Otsu, which is nearby. And he was third dan, I think, and she encouraged me to go out and see Brian and have a talk to him about kendo. So I did, and then I went through about a year and a half of starting to practice kendo for a couple of times a week in the evening times, and getting my beans during the day at judo. And I started to lean towards kendo, but it was a tough transition because my visa and a lot of other stuff, my friends, my social network was all tied up really with judo. But then I made the decision, and I've been thankful ever since because it suits me much better. I'm not a massively big guy. I'm pretty wide these days, but definitely much better suited for kendo. I basically fell in love with it from there, really.
Right. Well, I mean, you already had a background in martial arts and Budo before you started kendo, and I remember when I first started kendo, I didn't really have a background. I had a kind of a romantic image of the whole thing, and when I saw kendo for the first time, it sort of blew me away. It was actually I was more frightened than impressed, actually, seeing what was going on, because it's very, I mean, something like judo or karate, it's pretty easy to understand what's happening. If you throw somebody or you pin them down, that's that. But with kendo, it's just frantic whacking of sticks, and it looks rather painful. And let's face it, compared to other Budo, it takes a lot long to really understand what's going on when you start out. I mean, it took me a good 3 years before I knew what the hell I was doing, and even then. For you, how was it making that transition when you saw kendo for the first time, or you trained in it for the first time, and what were your impressions of it?
I think mine was probably a little different to yours, Alex, in the fact that you started your kendo at high school. I first saw kendo at Dorchester University. I took the trip along the hallway and stood in the doorway and thought, wow, that's, as you just said, that's very noisy and they're screaming, and I don't think I'm really interested in that. I went back to judo, but through the said ex-girlfriend, she convinced me to go along to Butokuden one Wednesday night, I think, from memory. And we went along and asked the guy, that there used to be a little guardhouse outside. We asked the guy outside if there were any classes for beginners. I mean, apart from the fact that I was a foreigner, there just wasn't, right?
Yeah.
But I stood at the door. Yeah. I stood at the door and watched, and the first impression I had was, hey, how come those old guys aren't just standing around on the outside watching the young guys get into it? Because that's the scene I'd been used to, and understandably, from judo. So in judo practices, you have the OBs come along, and, well, within reason, most of them over the age of 40, 45, they just can't get out and do randori. But there was this scene in front of me of, in those days, because as I say, I was only 20, 21 or something, there was these real old guys in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and even older, and they were taking it to these younger guys and really getting into it. So that really was my first impression. I thought, man, there must be something. Either those young guys are holding back, or those old guys have got something I don't know about. So that was something that I really intrigued me, so much so that I went on a serious hunt for a place that I could train as an adult beginner and not have to go through a high school or whatever. And I was lucky enough to find one, and then it progressed from there.
Okay, and so you stayed in Kyoto to do kendo for how many years?
I started kendo, I guess, in 81, and we left Kyoto early 85. So right. For doing kendo there, my initially was 4.5 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was when you took one of the senseis that had taken you under his wing in Kyoto back to New Zealand and sort of reinvigorated the rather, let's say, unorthodox kendo scene that was in existence at the time.
Yeah. Well, it was unbeknown to me, really. And you're right, yes. I was fortunate to meet Imasato Masayoshi Sensei, the late Imasato Masayoshi Sensei in Kyoto. And he was very keen on going to New Zealand. I had, at that stage, a girlfriend that was later to be my wife that I wanted to introduce to my parents. And there were 2 or 3 others, kendo friends of mine. And I'm just thinking back, I think it was a little bit more than 4 years because I remember going back to New Zealand, I was a 4th dan. So even the fact that I don't think I even got my EQ because I don't think they existed in those days. Just doing the maths, I think it was probably 80 to 85, 86. But anyway, ended up going back with Imasato Sensei and 4 or 5 others. I had no contacts in New Zealand kendo, so I went through Sulai Tolis, who is still a practicing 6th dan here in New Zealand, because she had a judo background, and I asked her, and she said, "Oh wow, you've got a 7th dan coming to New Zealand. I don't think we've ever had a 7th dan," which of course was a mistake because Kasahara Sensei and his delegation had been there. But anyway, she was good enough, along with a gentleman by the name of Ken Wells, who happens to be a 6th dan here as well. So they've stuck with it. They're good enough to organise a seminar for a couple of days in Auckland. And so we went back with Imasato Sensei and all their gear, had the seminar, realised that there was some interesting stuff going on, and there was, it was just the start of people realising that perhaps there was a slightly different way of doing kendo, and yeah, I went from there.
So diplomatic.
Politician, mate. That's what happens.
Yeah, gone are the bad old days when people use sledgehammers and axes from Wakigamai to do some strange version of kendo. So you sort of, with taking Imasato Sensei back, holding that seminar, you were able to show the people who were already really attracted to kendo for various reasons that, well, actually, there is another way of doing it. Let's just call it the correct way. I'm sort of curious. This was just a little bit before my time, and I think it was 1988, wasn't it? They had the Seoul World Championships. That was the year of the Seoul Olympics, I think. That was your first foray into the international competitive scene, I believe. You went over as...
No, you've got the wrong information.
Oh, have I? You sure about that?
For your information, no. New Zealand has been represented in every World Championships from 1970 right through. Yep. It was represented in 1970 by the said Brian Haddart.
Yep.
And the late Rick Littlewood. Then it did have a break, but in 19...
No, what I'm talking about, Graham, is you. That was your first foray, and not New Zealand.
No, what I'm saying is it wasn't. I went to the 1985 World Championships.
Oh, okay. Where were they held?
In Paris.
In Paris. Ah, yes, of course. Okay. So that was the first one that you went to. Did you go as a New Zealand representative to Paris?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Well, in the absence of anyone coming from New Zealand, and the fact that we had 4 New Zealanders practicing in Kyoto at the time, myself, Sulai Tolis, 2 gentlemen, Mike Hopley and Roland Sellis, we were all practicing at the Kodokan Machi Dojo and also at Sangyo University. We made a team up, and Imasato Sensei was our coach. And my dear wife was was our manager. And away we went to the World Championships. For your listeners or viewers, in those days, there was no separate women's competition. The men fought with the women, and you could put a team out of 3 people in a five-person Chiai. Yes, and that was my as a matter of fact, my first taste of international kendo, to be totally honest, was 2 weeks prior to the Paris World Championships. I found myself in London visiting some of my relatives, and I was told through Brian Kay that I could come along to the British teams and Japanese teams practice, because the Japanese team was doing some time in London prior to it. And it was promptly roped in by the late Sugo sensei to help with my wife to do all the, not all of it, but a hell of a lot of translation that needed to be done all at the last moment for the championships. But that was my first opportunity to see top level in those days, British Kenshi, mixing it up with the Japanese one. So that was a major eye-opener for me personally.
Right. Well, with the, I guess you could call it the infamous 1988 World Championships in Seoul, it's sort of gone down in New Zealand, not New Zealand, sorry, world kendo history as something that's not talked about so much in polite company. Can you perhaps recall some of the events of that fateful tournament?
Just to give your viewers a very quick background, one of my main hobbies outside of my life with kendo is photography, and I try to take a reasonable amount of time photographing. In those days, it wasn't photographing; I had this video camera, and I do remember being told to move as things were being thrown from behind me onto the Shiaijo during the events that you're referring to. So, and I've probably got a videotape of it somewhere. But the fact is that for me personally, I tried just to make it so that it was a good experience for myself, for Chikaya, my wife, and the team. And we weren't mixed up in politics. We weren't mixed up with what was being said around the place. I had the wonderful experience of meeting a lot of really cool people. Spent the evening with Victor Harris. It was just a fantastic experience, and the Koreans really put it on. However, there was a lot of tension, and it was a bit of it was an education in the fact that, oh, wow, there's some people here who are pretty passionate about their kendo, whatever came from that. It happened to be in Seoul at the same time. There were a lot of demonstrations like there were in those days, and that was a bit of an eye opener for the New Zealand team. I remember leaving the airport in taxis and having to make a detour because of all the fires. The students had been throwing Molotov cocktails, and there were sirens everywhere. And at that time we had a full team, so we actually had 12. We had 12 people. A lot of them had never been to Japan or never been in Asia before. So getting off the plane and being hit with that was an interesting experience. But still, hey.
Indeed. Well, just go back to your shugyo experiences, I guess you could say. I know that you've spent a number of years in Japan, going to and from New Zealand, and you have received advice and instruction from a number of sensei. Who do you think think, and I know it's a difficult question to answer because we always feel so indebted to so many people, and it seems unfair to point one or two people out. But who do you believe has really influenced the way you think about kendo more than anybody else? Who's had the greatest influence on the way that you approach your kendo, the way you think about your kendo?
I'd probably have to be honest and say that Kendo is a pursuit. I get that, but it's actually, for me, it's like a lifetime friend, and I've always relied on Kendo throughout my life to get me through tough times, to help me celebrate when good things happen, and so on and so forth. So I do. You're right. I have one or two key sensei that in the dojo, they were extremely influential in the way that I view my kendo and the way that I practice my kendo. But I also have sensei who, perhaps on the other hand, were not so well known nationally and internationally, that have had a huge impact on me in my everyday life, whether it be my business or my relationships or whatever. To give you some examples, Fujimura Shoji Sensei was a sensei of mine in the early days in Kyoto, and an absolutely brilliant businessman and entrepreneur, and I learned so much from him, yet not particularly amazingly well known for his kendo. So I had a number of experiences like that. The 7 years, if I include my judo years that I spent in Japan in my 20s, that was one thing. But I also returned to Japan in 2009 through until 2015. And during that time, Inoue Yoshihiko Sensei from Yaizu, Inoue Hanshi, even up until that date, had been a big influence on me. But it gave me the opportunity from 2009 through to 2014-15 to actually just be a member of his dojo and just go about. We had a manufacturing business. We were really busy doing normal stuff that everybody does. And I was just a normal member. And I am indebted to Inoue Sensei for what he imparted and what I learned from him over that period. So, as I say, I to be honest, I could rattle off a list of sensei that have helped me in different times. But, it's a big, long journey. So
it's thanks to you that Inoue Sensei came to New Zealand several times before he died, and I know firsthand as well what a wonderful man he was, and the inspiration that he provided to kendo practitioners in New Zealand. Have you got a few anecdotes or things that stick out in your memory of that sort of demonstrate the sagacity of this great man, Inoue Sensei? Some things that perhaps other people might never know otherwise. Because he was internationally very well known, wasn't he? And nationally as well. He's a paragon of kendo virtue, and it was also very, very into his kendo kata, and it was really one of the main philosophers of kendo kata in Japan, I think.
I absolutely agree with you. I have a lot of stories with Inoue Sensei, and I would have to say that you're right in the fact that he changed the way that people, especially in New Zealand, because we didn't just have a few trips from him. I think we had 7 or 8 over a 10 or 11, 12-year period. And he suddenly came on the scene and he explained to people that you're doing kendo, and kendo is love. And we also, and in those days I would have been translating. And Alex, you know what it's like translating. You sort of translate the words and then you think, oh, I wonder what that means. But there's already said something else, so you don't get a chance to actually digest it yourself.
Yeah.
But I guess one of the big things is that the sensei impressed upon me that a dojo is a place for people to kind of like conduct the study of their life, if you like. It's a place that through kendo that you can come to in the hard times, come to in the good times, take whatever you need from kendo, then give some stuff back. And so through Inoue Sensei, I think not just myself, but many of us got a more holistic view of what kendo can be. And so, yeah, that's as I say, I mean, I could go in with a few stories about parties, and he was very renowned for his his singing and his capacity drinking and a few other things. But that aside, he was a spectacular person in many ways.
Yeah,
and very, very.
Well, just you've mentioned, he sort of gave you a more holistic idea of how kendo works, how kendo and life connects. What are some of the major hurdles, hardships, difficulties that you've had to overcome in kendo? What have been the big challenges that have, life does get in the way sometimes, and there's as you get older, sort of priorities shift. What are some of the things that you've overcome that have kept you in kendo, and what are the lessons that you've learned from those?
Okay, all right. I think if I start from the sort of judo kendo days, I realized by starting kendo that I could actually have an active martial arts, because as you referred to before, I went to do judo because I like fighting. I didn't like Japanese culture. I could hardly speak any Japanese at all. It was never a thought in my mind. To me, judo was a sport. And then when I got to Japan, I realized that it was a lot more than that. But then kendo came along and it added so many more dimensions to the whole thing. So I think that in my early days, I owe any Japanese conversational ability that I may have now, I owe it to kendo. My very first kendo teacher at the beginner's course was 83 years old Ota Sensei, a retired pharmacist who had a very strong Kyoto dialect and false teeth. And my ability to understand any Japanese was bad enough. But you get a combination of that being yelled at you the whole time. You go home and you nag your friends and your girlfriend and you say, look, what was he saying? He kept saying, for example, I can't. But for your viewers, which means no good, rubbish, do it again, waste of time. And I for weeks I went on trying to, because I couldn't pronounce it properly, try to explain to my friends outside, what's this Akani thing that the sensei keeps yelling at me? So anyway, what it did, it forced me to go to school and picked up grammar books and I went along and I thought I had to seriously learn how to at least have a conversation in Japanese. So the kendo, I owe that to kendo big time. Mm-hmm. Go into my 30s and we're married and we're back here in New Zealand and I'm getting inspired by people that are not in Japan but they still love doing kendo, and suddenly you start a family and all the pressures and you start, in my particular case, you start a business which is really busy and so on and so forth. You need to have that place you can go, that quiet time. And this is really hard, I guess, especially if there's any beginners out there listening. Kendo to me is a quiet time. Okay, it's noisy around the outsides of the things, but it's very quiet in your mind. And there is nothing else that you can think of when you're doing kendo other than kendo. And therefore it's extremely relaxing, mentally a relaxing, a chance to, put the worries of the world aside. So starting a family through my 30s, having a son who I forced to do kendo. There's no two ways about it. We didn't have a lot of parenting books in those days, but arm up the back, and he got chucked into the dojo. No, and it's great. I mean, he's continued to do kendo, and he's a fourth dan now, and he plays it. But what it taught me was that there are ways of kendo helping other people without you needing to actually push it on them. So I did a lot of growing, again, through kendo at that time. And go on a few decades. I've always been one that has struggled with gradings. And my fifth dan, sixth dan was no different, really. I really need to experience a grading. As much as you're told to go with the confidence of passing the first time, you can do it, and all the practice and all the rest of the drama, when push comes to shove, it just doesn't go like that, for me anyway. And so resilience comes in. And whilst I'm doing that, you have the challenges, in my case, of tendinitis, a number of other relatively decent injuries, thankfully not illnesses or sicknesses, but injuries. And I guess my time in judo and stuff taught me that, you can push through these things. And so that was, I guess, another example of making me think that, well, I can do this. And I want to just go back to the dojo, listen to some people, do some more practice. And I must admit, in 2009, even though it may not have been at the top of my wife's list for going back to Japan, it was definitely near the top of mine. And I had been sixth dan, I think, for 8 or 9 years at that stage, and really wanted to challenge myself for seventh dan. And it was just that, a major challenge. Mm. And I had, as we've just mentioned, I was in the dojo of one of the best sensei that you could have been in for the whole world. And it's, so that taught me that you've got to persist. You've got to keep going. Mm.
What do you think was, I remember, the hard times you were having with Nanadan, because your build up was as good as anybody could ever hope for, being in Inoue Sensei's dojo, and training feels good, and then the grade just doesn't come for whatever reason, and it's back to the drawing board. In retrospect, looking back at it all, what do you think it was that took you over the edge in the end and sort of gave you that Nanadan? What's the difference between the Nanadan and the Rokudan? What was it in your kendo that was different in the end?
Yeah. I would have to say that the balance between the physical training and the necessity to have yourself at my particular time, I was 58, but however good you could be for me as a 58-year-old physically, that was one thing. Understanding that the way you talk to yourself during the jitsugi, especially, for me, the way I talk to myself in the dojo, especially with Inoue Sensei sitting up the top of the dojo most of the time, looking at you. No, that's Kyoto dialect. I'm not too sure what the Shizuoka equivalent is, but with Inoue Sensei, it's probably saying nothing. That was enough. But I realized that my self-talk in a grading situation was completely different to my self-talk in the dojo, because I was going away with glowing glowing, but I was going away with things are going well. Yeah, oh, well done, Graham. In the dojo. And I was going to gradings and it just wasn't happening. I perhaps it's an excuse, I'm not sure, but one thing that did happen was that, and this is happening in a lot of machi dojos in Japan, because they're not bringing in a lot of beginners, you end up with a machi dojo with a hell of a lot of people sitting out the front. And this was happening big time in Inoue Dojo. So we had a situation where parallel with me, there would have been 5 or 6 one female kenshi and 4 or 5 male kenshi who were on the same journey, and we continuously could not break through no matter where we went. Inoue Sensei died, and after he passed away, every one of those people passed within the next 7 or 8 months. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether that's connected or not, but I've spoken to those people since, and for me, when I passed, it wasn't just when I did the kata, but I could not get Inoue Sensei out of my mind. And I think one of the first times my thinking in the dojo actually matched what I was thinking in the jitsugi, in the exam. So for me, that was a major turning point. And now I use that. Perhaps not that it shows that much, I don't know, but I do use it for myself. We have because the Inoue Sensei is the pastor Shihan of our dojo, so we have a photo there. There isn't a practice goes by that I don't take a look at the photo and just take a little bit in and then go out to practice. It's important for me. It's part of kind of like a ritual.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of dojo, just recently the Auckland Kendo Club opened a new dojo, a little bit more in a central area, I understand. I know that Auckland Kendo Club has had a series of beautiful dojos over the years, but eventually the lease runs out and is a mad scramble to find another place to pour all of your time, effort, money, blood, sweat and tears into getting another dojo up and running. So this time, obviously I can't get back to New Zealand because of COVID, but looking at the photos, it's quite a magnificent setting that you have there now, better than perhaps anything you've ever had until now.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And yes, we're immensely proud of the dojo we have now. Just to give a little bit of context to people that are listening, as a small machi dojo, and we're like so many other dojo around the world. We're totally charity based. No one gets paid. All the money that comes in goes out. We chose in 1991 to use a lease and renovate model as opposed to go for it and try and buy a building and hold on to it. In other words, own the land and a trust and all the rest of it. So that has caused us to go through, since 1991 until the other day, we opened up our 3rd dojo. It doesn't mean we've got 3 dojos. We've only ever had 1 dojo building. And for us, it's been a successful model. And I must say, configuration-wise, light-wise, the way the light comes into the dojo at the moment, and floor-wise, this place is the best. Location-wise as well, to be honest, Auckland's a very spread-out place. And as Alex, as you mentioned before, we've been fortunate in New Zealand that being the little Shimagumi, or the little island nation that we are, we've managed to keep COVID at bay. I mean, we have no infections at the time of this recording in our community. We have a few in quarantine, but we're keeping it at bay. So we're actually living a normal life. Therefore, we are doing beginners courses. We are doing what we would normally do, but we're doing it with so much more gusto, so much more keenness now that we've started this year and I'd have to check back, but I think we've got near 20 new full-time members. And as we all know, you put people through beginners courses, you're very lucky if 10% stays. We haven't put 200 people through, but I think our beginners courses have been pretty good. And I think that people have extra money, believe it or not, that they would have perhaps normally spent maybe going overseas or going somewhere for a holiday, that they thought, hey, until this COVID thing gets under control, what can I do? And they've gone out looking for new stuff to do. And we've been the benefactor of that, or Kendo has. Happy with the dojo, happy with the progress we're making.
So it's sort of like really 2021 it's been it's a new beginning in many ways, isn't it, for Auckland Kendo and New Zealand Kendo as a whole. One, because of your new wonderful dojo, and it sounds like everything's going very well with beginners and getting a new infusion of enthusiasm and retention level. It's just so important and so difficult. You were president of the New Zealand Kendo Federation for over 30 years. And as I mentioned in the introduction, with the overhaul of the New Zealand Federation itself in terms of what kind of entity it is, you stepped down and we created a board of directors, and now you're focusing your efforts more on developing Kendo, not nationally, but in Auckland, but obviously that turns out to be nationally in the end. In your 30-odd years of overseeing Kendo in New Zealand, what have been some of the notable changes or developments that you saw? And as an extension of that, where do you think New Zealand Kendo is going from now, or what are your hopes for it at least?
I think, Alex, I'm sure any instructor level people around the world that are watching this will agree that one of the biggest changes we've seen in Kendo over the last 30 years, which of course has affected the New Zealand Kendo Federation and our dojo and any other dojos in New Zealand, is the type of person that starts Kendo and the drivers that gets them to the door. As I've just explained to you, I mean, I came from a judo background. A little bit of an exception for the day. Most of the people that I knew that were in Kendo seriously had some sort of other martial art background. Now we are not getting that. We're getting people coming because they want to do something unique. In New Zealand, we're a sporting nation. We've got so much emphasis on getting out and getting physical and exercising and doing this and doing that a lot of our, not even our new immigrants, but a lot of our younger people are going, well, I don't want to play rugby. I don't want to play netball. There must be something else I can do. And so I think we're benefiting because of that. So to me, the change of your average beginner profile has been huge over the last 30 odd years. It's been massive. And trying to monitor that as a national body is is a really hard thing to do, because I'm sure New Zealand's not unique in the fact that there's probably more of this type of person in this city as opposed to this type of person in that city, and so on and so forth. Like in New Zealand, Auckland is the biggest centre by a mile. Consequently, it attracts most of our new immigrants. But you go to Invercargill, which is right at the bottom of the South Island, it has a booming club there. But it has to rely on, not catering, but going into the population and dragging out people that are interested. We have a dojo near to Auckland in a place called Hamilton, which is connected to the Waikato University. Up until COVID, the 90% of their new members came from overseas people who are there studying. And that dojo has done over the 20, maybe 5 years it's been in existence, an amazing job of getting people invested in Kendo. And then they've gone out to different parts of the world or different cities, and then they've grown and grown kendo. So I think the type of people, not the type of people, but the drivers to make people start kendo has changed for me over 35 years. I would also say that because along with Ken Wells and a number of other people, when we started, I think we had about 80 people doing kendo in New Zealand. And it hasn't perhaps grown massively, but the numbers of dojo have grown. And so you can't run the federation like we did in 1990, as if it was like a big dojo with a few guys down in the South Island. I mean, you had your dojo down there and communicate with them every now and then. It had to be run on a different way, and that was a struggle. It really was. And one of my big hopes for the new structure, as you've explained, is that we now have a board of people who come from different backgrounds, and very importantly, they come from different areas of New Zealand, so they can bring their issues to the fore. They can bring their ideas much easier to the board of directors, and then cascade it down and get stuff going. So I have, I think New Zealand Kendo has a really bright future with the structure that we have now. So,
Great. Well, thank you very much, Graham. As a long-time friend, there's so many other things that I just want to talk about and chew the fat with, but it's already been an hour, can you believe?
Okay.
Yeah, no, fascinating stuff. And once again, thank you for all that you have done for New Zealand Kendo and international Kendo over the years. I just wish I could get back to New Zealand sometime soon to stomp on those nice new floorboards in your new dojo. But
you're always welcome, as is everyone else, Alex. But I would like to say that, because I'm looking at your background there, and for those of you who are listening to this and think, oh, it's okay for Alex and it's okay for Graham, they speak Japanese, they read and write Japanese. I don't read and write Japanese. Or I do, to the level of a 5-year-old or something. So if you, I struggle through some stuff. But I tell you what, when Kendo World came on the scene, and I don't want to turn it into an ad, but the work that's being done to translate important information there's just no comparison with the struggle that we had 20 or 30 years ago getting this stuff. It's completely different. And I will correct you on one thing, Alex. You said that I've been doing kendo for 35 years. It's actually 41 this year. So it just goes so quickly. So you've got to make the best of it. And thank you, mate, because, as I said before, all that information that's coming through has helped me, and I'm sure it's helping a lot of other people as well. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, mate. I said 35 years because I wanted to make you out to be younger than what you really are.
The face gives it away.
Thanks very much, mate.